All right. The head of an HR department at a large nonprofit organization that works on poverty alleviation was approached by an employee who was about to accuse another employee of threatening them with violence. The accuser was friends with the head of HR and admitted that the accusation of misconduct was false. And she also admitted that the accusation was intended to push the accused out of the organization. Nevertheless, the accuser correctly noted that due to the organization's history and values, the accusation would be believed by nearly everybody in the organization, and anyone who stood in the way would face severe social repercussions. The head of HR tried to persuade the accuser to not make the accusation, but was unsuccessful. Once the accusation was made, the head of HR decided to pretend as though they had not received the confession from the accuser. And they did this because they thought that the good of the organization would be fostered far more by believing the accusation than by challenging it. So they believed this correctly. They believed that it is vitally important to create an environment where survivors of threats of violence are believed. And they worried that standing up to this accusation, even though they knew it would be false, would set a bad precedent. It would take a step backwards in the creation of such an environment. So, as I said, the head of HR was put in an extremely rare situation. And believe it or not, this is actually a real situation. It's a little bit disguised, but it's a real one that I actually consulted on. The situation was also awful. It was so awful that I don't know how I would have reacted, and I don't think you do either, given that the situation is a really surprising and upsetting and distressing one. And given this nature of the situation, I believe that we should have sympathy for her and take the attitude of, there but for the grace of God, go I. Nevertheless, even though I don't know exactly what I would have done, I think that we should still have the intuition that at the end of the day, what HR did was deeply wrong. And the moral theory that I'm going to be exploring in this video helps make sense of that intuition. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724, died in 1804, was a philosopher who has a reputation of being very difficult to understand. His basic insights are extremely compelling, though, and my hope is that I can explain them to you in such a way that you're going to understand where he was coming from. So let's begin with a moral principle that shares many similarities with Kant's ethical framework, and this is the Golden Rule. The simplest statement of the Golden Rule goes as follows: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. To put it another way, treat others how you would like to be treated. In the case of HR representative in this situation, it seemed clear that the Golden Rule gives the correct judgment. She would not like it if someone else were to allow a false accusation about her to go uncorrected, so she shouldn't let a false accusation against someone else go uncorrected. Now, Immanuel Kant actually rejects the Golden Rule, and he rejects it for the following reason. What if the head of HR was a fanatic who would gladly accept a false accusation against her in the pursuit of a workplace where accusations of violence are believed and never questioned? If she would not object to being treated in such a way, then it would seem the Golden Rule does not provide us with an objection against her conduct. Now, in my lectures, I really like to make sure that the moral theories that I'm presenting are treated fairly. And with this in mind, I don't think that Kant's discussion of the Golden Rule is fair, because I don't think that the spirit of the Golden Rule is actually captured very well in the phrase, treat others the way you would like to be treated. I think that a better formulation of the Golden Rule goes something like this: treat others the way you would like to be treated if you were them with their preferences. And that formulation of the Golden Rule survives the critique that I just presented. At any rate, Kant rejects the Golden Rule, and the question we need to ask now is, what's the alternative? So let's go back to the case of the HR representative. When I reflect on my intuitions about the case, two things stand out. The first is that I am bothered by the fact that the accused employee was treated unfairly. And the second is that I'm bothered by the fact that the HR representative was most likely acting inconsistently. She was making statements that contradicted what she knew to be true, and she was treating him in a way that was inconsistent with the rule that she most likely would have liked to have been applied to her were she in his shoes. Now, Kant's alternative to the Golden Rule is called the Principle of Universalizability, and it supports both of these intuitions. It goes like this. An act is morally acceptable if and only if its maxim is universalizable. So let's slow down and unpack this definition. A maxim is, to quote Russ Schaefer-Landau, a principle of action that you give to yourself when you are about to do something. A maxim has two parts, a description of an action and a reason for performing that action. For example, take the following maxim. Listen to your friends when they're upset so that you can help them feel better. The thing that you are about to do is listen to your friends, and your reason for listening to them is to help them feel better. Every action has a maxim, but we might not always be aware of what our maxim is. So then sometimes we have to dig deep to figure out why we're doing what we're doing. Now, I want you to note that when Kant says that all actions have maxims, he's not saying that all of our behaviors have maxims, because not all behaviors count as rational actions. So if you startle me and I jump, my jumping isn't an action with a maxim. It's just an involuntary response to a stimulus. Moreover, sometimes we just do things on a whim. Suppose that when I'm angry, I yell at people. When I'm happy, I just instinctively compliment them. And suppose that these responses are unreflective responses to my emotional states rather than decisions that I would have chosen to make. And Kant's going to have the same diagnosis of someone who performs good deeds simply because they're responding to the pleasant feeling that they have when they help others. They're just sort of responding instinctively to that feeling. Such behaviors would not count as actions that can be evaluated as good or bad because the individuals performing them are not acting on maxims. They're just instinctively responding to feelings. So we're now ready to contrast, at least we're ready to start contrasting Kant's moral theory with utilitarianism. So according to utilitarianism, recall that the rightness of an action depends on the amount of intrinsic value associated with its outcome. Now, according to Kant, the rightness of an action depends on the goodness or badness of its maxim. In principle, in particular, an action that meets the universalizability principle is good, and when that doesn't is not. And this is to say, an action with a universalizable maxim is good. An action that does not meet this condition is morally impermissible. How do we apply the universalizability principle? Well, Schaefer-Landau expresses it as a three-step process. Step 1, formulate your maxim, which means to clearly state what you intend to do and why you intend to do it. Step 2, imagine a world in which everyone supports and acts on your maxim. Then step 3, ask, can the goal of my action be achieved in such a world? Let's apply that test to the case of the HR representative from the beginning. So her maxim was, allow false accusations of violence to go unchallenged so that people will believe accusations of violence. So that's the first step. We just formulated the maxim. Second step is to imagine a world where everyone supports and acts on that maxim. So in this case, what we're imagining is a world where everyone allows false accusations of violence to go unchallenged. And their motivation for doing it is that they want people to believe the accusations of violence. So then finally we reach the third step, which is to ask whether the goal of the action can be achieved in such a world. And in this case, the goal cannot be achieved. This is for the following reason. A world in which everyone allows false accusations of violence to go unchallenged is just not a world in which people will have any reason to believe accusations of violence. And this is because such a world is exactly the sort of world where one cannot trust accusations of violence. And therefore, her maxim fails the universalizability test. Now, to be clear, the universalizability test is not about asking whether the consequences of a particular maxim are good. I'm going to repeat what I just said because it's very important and you need to know it. We are not asking whether the consequences of following a maxim are good or bad. If our procedure were to involve asking about, say, the net happiness in a world where everyone follows that maxim, then our procedure would be a consequentialist procedure. Instead, what we're asking is whether it's possible to conceive of a world in which everyone acts on a maxim and where the goal of the action is achieved. What we're asking is there a contradiction between the goal that an actor is setting out to accomplish and the maxim that she is acting on while doing so? Now, one of the most powerful things about this universalizability test is that morality is tied closely to rationality. Here's what I mean by that. If I tell you, thou shalt not kill, and I tell you that you must believe that proposition because God said so, then I'm endorsing a moral theory that ties morality to God's commands. What Kant is doing instead is saying that we should determine the morality of your action based on whether you are contradicting yourself when you perform that action. In particular, we should ask whether the maxim you are acting on is consistent with the goal that you are trying to accomplish. So, is Kant correct that immoral conduct is irrational? So Schaefer-Landau argues convincingly that the answer is no. He begins by presenting the following argument. Premise 1. People have a reason to do something only if doing it will get them what they care about. Premise 2, doing their moral duty sometimes fails to get people what they care about. And then conclusion, therefore people sometimes lack any reason to do their moral duty. And then, if people lack any reason to do their moral duty, then violating their moral duty can be perfectly rational. And then our final conclusion, therefore, it can be perfectly rational for people to violate their moral duty. Now, I want you to consider a ruthless contract killer who believes that he has no reason to do what morality requires. His attitude towards morality is the same as my attitude towards the rules of baseball. It's something that other people do. I recognize that baseball is something that other people do, but I'm just not interested in playing that game. And when the contract killer kills someone for money, there's a sense that he is reasoning in a way that is consistent. He doesn't care about morality. He does care about money, and he's therefore violating a moral duty in a way that is rational based on the way that we're understanding rational in the argument that he just presented. So Kant is an objection, a response to this objection, and to understand it, we're going to need to distinguish between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Imagine that you're someone who enjoys running, and you enjoy talking about philosophy at the same time. If both of those descriptions apply to you, then you should join the running group that I'm most likely going to form that's going to run just a couple miles after class, after we finish class, once it gets warmer out. If you don't enjoy those things, though, then you don't have any reason to join the group. For this reason, the imperative, join the running group, is a hypothetical imperative. It is a command that is a reason for you to act only if you have a particular set of desires. Without those desires, the command has no force for you. Let's go back to the argument. If all reasons are hypothetical imperatives, then premise 1 is true. However, Kant is going to reject premise 1 and say instead that some imperatives are categorical imperatives. A categorical imperative is a reason for acting that we have regardless of what our desires and preferences are. A categorical imperative is a command that everyone must follow no matter what. If you violate a categorical imperative, we are acting contrary to reason. All moral imperatives are categorical imperatives. So that was a lot. Go back 30 or so seconds if you didn't catch all that the first time. But we're going to move on. The challenge for Kant is to defend the following claim. It is rational for you to act morally, even if acting morally goes against desires that are very important to you. And Kant has an argument for this conclusion that Schaefer-Landau presents as follows. Premise 1, if you are rational, then you are consistent. Premise 2, if you are consistent, then you obey the principle of universalizability. Premise 3, if you obey the principle of universalizability, then you act morally. Premise 4, which is our first conclusion, therefore, if you are rational, then you act morally. And then premise 5, our final conclusion, therefore, if you act immorally, then you are irrational. So let's just grant premises 1 and 2. The problem with this argument is that premise 3 is false. So suppose that I don't want anybody coming on my property. One way of making sure that nobody enters my yard is for me to just throw rocks at everyone except me who enters my yard. If everyone joins me in throwing rocks at everyone except me who enters my yard, then that would be great for me. It would make it unlikely that anyone except for me is going to enter my yard. Therefore, the maxim, throw rocks at people so they won't enter Aaron's yard, passes the universalizability test. However, conduct is clearly immoral because rocks hurt when you get hit by them, and people have good reasons to enter my yard sometimes, and therefore premise 3 is false. Now, one of the most fascinating things about Kant scholarship is that many scholars think that Kant was wrong about the implications of his own theory. And one of the clearest examples of this has to do with absolute moral prohibitions against practices like lying. Kant was very clear that he thought that it was always morally impermissible to lie. And in fact, in 1797, Kant published a short article in a Berlin periodical called On a Supposed Right to Tell Lies from Benevolent Motives. In that little article, which is quite accessible, you should go read it, he discussed a case in which a friend is hiding in your house from a murderer. And Kant thinks that it's wrong to lie to the murderer when she comes to your front door and asks whether your friend is hiding inside. Now, the reason why lying is morally impermissible, according to Kant, even in this case, is that it fails the universalizability principle. When you lie, in that case, you are acting on the following maxim: lie to hide your friend from a murderer. If everyone were acting on that maxim, then that would be a world where all statements made to murderers about whether someone is hiding inside a house are going to be regarded with suspicion. And so a world in which everyone follows the maxim is just not a world in which performing the action will achieve the intended result, because the murderer is just not going to believe your lie. So as I said, one of the most fascinating things about Kant scholarship is that many scholars think that Kant was incorrect about some of the implications of his own theory. And in this case, a lot of scholars think that Kant was wrong to think that there are absolute prohibitions against lying. Now, the reason for this is that the rightness of an action depends on the maxim that an agent was acting on. When I lie to the murderer at the door, I needn't act on a maxim that says lie to murderers to save your friend's life. Instead, I can act on a maxim that says say whatever you need to say in order to save the life of an innocent person. In a world where everyone follows that maxim, the goal I'm seeking to achieve will be achieved. So let's now move on to autonomy. Kant gives several different formulations of the categorical imperative that are supposed to be equivalent to one another. So one formulation is called the formula of humanity. And it goes like this: always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. That formulation, again, comes from Russia Fernando's reconstruction of it in his Intro to Ethics textbook. So to be clear, not all humans are human beings. And this is an important point. In order to be considered a human being in Kant's sense of it, you must be rational. And I also want you to note that not all human beings are from the species Homo sapiens. Any rational robot, any animal, or any alien would count as a human being in this sense if they're rational. Now, there are many ways that we use one another as a means of bringing about our own ends. If I sell you a sandwich, I'm using you as a means of getting money, and you are using me as a means of getting a sandwich. Nevertheless, I'm also treating you as an end in yourself, and you are treating me as an end in myself. You're a rational agent who is seeking the end of having a sandwich, and I'm recognizing this fact about you when inviting you to engage in a consensual transaction without force, coercion, or deception. If, on the other hand, I had simply robbed you or deceived you into giving me your money, I would be treating you simply as an obstacle between me and the money I want. I would be treating you merely as a means to the ends that I am seeking. All right, let's now turn back to the story from the beginning and consider again why the HR representative's action seemed reprehensible. When the head of HR sacrificed the accused for the good of the organization, she was using him merely as a means and not treating the humanity in him as an end in itself. We can also make sense of a lot more common moral judgments using this formula of humanity. So as we talked about on Thursday, according to utilitarianism, it was permissible to feed your classmate Grace, I believe her name was Grace, to the utility monster. And in fact, feeding her to the monster was morally required according to utilitarianism. However, to do so would be to treat her merely as a means rather than to treat the humanity in her as an end in itself. Slavery is also intrinsically wrong because it involves using somebody merely as a means. Now, another thing that the formula of humanity does is it makes sense of our intuitions about paternalism. I'm sure that we've all had the experience when someone intervenes in our lives in a way that we don't want, that they thought was for our own good. So perhaps somebody took away your phone so that you wouldn't watch TikTok videos endlessly for hours on end and turn into a soulless husk of a person. When people do that to us, it feels really bad because they're not treating us as a rational agent. Instead of reasoning with us about what we ought to do, they're treating us like an object that they are caring for and intervening directly into our lives without our willing participation in the intervention. And that's why I'm giving you reasons to avoid social media, or at least cut down on it, rather than trying to force you to stop using it. I'm treating the humanity and use an end in yourself. I'm going to mention one more thing, and this is that the formula of humanity supports universal rights for all human beings and provides a principled way of criticizing cultural practices that violate them. Everyone who is a human being deserves to have their autonomy respected. I want you to notice how I framed that last statement. I framed it as universal rights for all human beings rather than universal human rights. My reasoning for this framing is that, as I mentioned before, Kant only included rational agents within the scope of humanity. What this means is that on a Kantian picture, many members of our species are such that we have no moral duties to them whatsoever. This includes infants, includes people with some mental illnesses, and people who have significant intellectual disabilities. Leaving people in those categories out in the cold, so to speak, should horrify us all. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are attracted to utilitarianism rather than Kant's ethical theory. Utilitarianism sounds kind of great right now, doesn't it? But when we're thinking about how we ought to treat someone, it seems like what we should be asking about is whether they're going to get hurt by what we are doing to them. And the fact that an infant, someone in the midst of experiencing a psychotic break, and someone with a severe intellectual disability may be incapable of reasoning right now, shouldn't mean that we have no duties to them. Their suffering matters now. In a couple of months, we're going to take a look at the work of Christine Korsgaard, a philosopher who thinks that Kantian ethics can be extended to include everyone who suffers. So she's part of the group of scholars who are trying to rescue Kant from the implications that he thought followed from his theory. But in this video, I'm going to focus on Kant's response to the objection. So his first response to this objection is that harming non-human animals, infants, and etc. will make us more likely to harm rational beings. There's two problems with this argument. First is that the causal chain, the causal claim it's based on just might not be accurate. Like maybe it's possible that for some people, they can hurt a non-human animal in a significant way without going on to hurt a human. So I don't know. And the second problem is that Kant can't avail himself of consequentialist arguments. So since Kant thought that what makes an action right is the maxim it's based on, rather than the consequences of performing it, he doesn't then get to criticize hurting animals on the grounds that the consequences of doing that are bad. Now, I'm actually going to defend Kant. I'm going to defend Kant against this second critique of his first defense. And it goes like this. According to Kant, we have perfect duties and we have imperfect duties. The perfect duties are duties to follow the categorical imperative. Imperfect duties of beneficence, however, are duties to foster the ends of others. And Immanuel Kant thought that we have significant discretion when it comes to how we discharge our imperfect duties of beneficence, or imperfect duties to benefit others. So put it another way, Kant doesn't tell us exactly what we must do when we have the opportunity to help someone else. But we shouldn't just simply sit back and let them suffer. So we can see here another contrast with utilitarianism. On utilitarian analysis, we know exactly how much we're supposed to help others. We're supposed to help them to the extent that doing so maximizes net utility. According to Kantian analysis, there's no precise prescription that tells us exactly how much we ought to help others. Now, when we're thinking about imperfect duties of beneficence, we can think about the consequences of our actions in the following way. We can ask whether an action is likely to help or hurt someone, and then we can perform acts that we think will help them. If we think that hurting infants or dogs is likely to lead people to hurt fully rational human beings, then we have an imperfect duty of beneficence to avoid hurting infants and dogs. So that was Kant's first attempt to defend a proscription against hurting beings who are non-rational and sentient. Kant's second attempt goes like this. Just as you shouldn't destroy my table, you shouldn't kill my cat, because doing so would hurt my interests. This second response fails for obvious reasons. It gives me no reason not to hurt my cat myself, and it also gives us no reason to not hurt wild animals. More fundamentally, Kant's responses fail for a deeper reason. There's something wrong about torturing a cat or an infant that has nothing whatsoever to do with the effects of that conduct on others. The suffering of those individuals matters morally because those individuals themselves are suffering.